because it's now 2 p.m.
Are you excited?
Okay, so I shall leave it to you, Najwa, to just accept people.
Sure. Sure.
Welcome. Please come in. I'll sit beside.
Assalamualaikum, Dr. Hassan.
Yeah, initially, and then I cut off. Then I
So I try to speak vetting where you have mics. I don't. Yeah, that's fine. I think we can do that.
I can put it closer.
I'm just pretty much done. How are you saying?
Assalamualaikum. Hi.
Okay, hello everyone. Apologies. I think we're running just slightly a bit late because of technical issues. I'm not sure whether the Wi-Fi has now resolved itself. There's a Wi-Fi problem, right? So I'm glad that Eklima is here. She has saved the day. Thank you, Eklima. Hello to everyone who's joining us online. The camera is over here. I would most likely move the camera around a bit later so that people will be able to see your beautiful faces too. So thank you everyone for being here. I think let's just start because it's now 2 p.m. and we have another event coming up towards the late afternoon. So happy World Teachers Day, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your constant support. We now see like regulars for the event that our office is organizing, which is great. Thank you, Dr. Shashi, for bringing your class always. So hi, Najla. Maybe you could also greet people.
Hello, everyone. It's so good to be here. I'm honored to be your online host. And if anyone is facing any technical issues, please let me know through the chat.
Not that Najla will be able to do anything about it, but she would be happy to hear about anything. Okay, so it is truly my pleasure to welcome everyone. Okay, so there are still people coming in. Yes, please join us. We do have people joining us online as well. Hi, good to see you, Dr. Mohammed. So I was just about to introduce our featured speaker for today. It is my absolute honor to have Dr. Mark Belden, former Associate Dean at the Office of Educational Research, NIE in Singapore for partnerships, correct? He also used to serve as chair of the Humanities and Social Studies Education for, what, 8 years?
Several years.
Yeah, 8 years, thereabouts. Yep, so Mark used to be a colleague of mine in Singapore at the NIE, and we also had a book club in Singapore and here as well in the UAE. So thank you so much for being here. Dr. Hala, our distinguished dean, is now with us. So today's discussion is kind of like a link to Dr. George's talk when he talked about when we had the conversation about being up close and personal with Stanford's top 2% research scientists. So initially, Dr. Mark wanted to call the session Up Close and Personal with a Highly Conflicted Academic. But he changed it slightly, but it touches on essentially that same tension and that same issue. So without further introduction, let's please welcome Dr. Mark.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Myra, and thank you for the opportunity to share some of my work and thinking about impact. When I wrote the abstract, I thought this was going to be a more formal academic talk, and I'm really happy that it's more of a conversation. I think we need to have more conversations, more dialogue and deliberation, and so I'm really pleased that we're able to have this opportunity. So, like I said, when I wrote the abstract, I was thinking I'd have to do slides and do a formal talk, but I gave that talk last week in Singapore, actually, because I talked at I did a webinar with a scholar from Canada on research impact, and it was based on a couple of small studies that I've done in Singapore. So part of my job was to talk to different stakeholders about research impact. And so I talked to policymakers, teachers, we talked to researchers, curriculum officials, people at the Ministry of Education, and we were really trying to find out, what do you want in terms of research? What would help inform policy and practice? And so it was very interesting to hear from different stakeholders what they want. They don't want academic research. they want research that's been translated. And I think more specifically, they want to engage with researchers. They want and not just for workshops, but I think they want a more sustained kind of engagement where researchers are in classrooms and working with teachers, working closely with policymakers. And so, that kind of impact, we work pretty hard at in Singapore to make sure that we were making impact with teachers, and so a lot of translational work. Teachers kept saying, we want infographics. We don't have time to read. We just don't have time to read. So, make it direct, they call it sharp, make it focused and really target what our needs are. So part of the work was to try to better understand the needs of stakeholders for research. And in Singapore, we have a very close relationship with the Ministry of Education and with the Academy of Singapore Teachers that does mainly professional development. And so really trying to target those audiences in terms of the kinds of research publications and really knowledge resources that we provided. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that, but I'm going to make this a little bit more personal and talk about my own experiences. And I think I'm pitching this towards graduate students, but I see we have some faculty here. So I think I'll try to make it more, applicable. But, I think it's this idea that impact can be broader than publishing in high impact journals and in terms of citations and H-index, that really we need to think about the many different ways that we can impact society and impact our stakeholders. And, I had a chance to talk at the webinar last week with Amanda Cooper from Queen's University in Canada. And I really recommend you looking up her work. She's involved with Research Impact Canada. And I've worked with David Phipps, who also he's at York University, but he works with Research Impact Canada. And I really think Canada is leading the way in terms of really thinking through real world impact and making sure that research is informing policy and practice. And so Amanda Cooper, last week, she heads Ripple. She's involved in Research Impact Canada. And this is really a government initiative. I mean, the government has really set up a lot of networks, and they really promote this across all of Canada to make sure that the research is making impact in society. And so she has some tremendous toolkits. If you go to her website, it's Ripple Research Informed Policy, Practice, and Leadership in Education. And so a lot of that work is designed to help universities and scholars really think about how they can make a broader kind of impact in society. And one of the things that I like is that Research Impact Canada is really focused on, sort of grand challenges within Canadian society. And so they've identified 4 areas that they're really promoting and trying to make sure that there's research that will inform policy and practice in these areas. And one is equity. The other is Indigenous peoples, Indigenous populations. A third is well-being. And then a fourth, I think, is math. It doesn't make sense, but I think sustainability, it might be the fourth one. I forget the fourth one, but and this is very consistent with, I think, some of the top universities around the world. So we see UCL, University College of London, Stanford Graduate School of Education, Nanyang Technological University is really focusing around what they're calling grand challenges. And so it's grand challenge research that they're really trying to promote. And so they tend to have 5 or 6 grand challenges that they're focusing their research and teaching around. And typically, I think UCL's is also equity. I think it's well-being and health as well. Social justice is in there. But sustainability and addressing climate change is, a significant grand challenge. So these are These are complex problems that require cross-disciplinary work. They require multidisciplinary efforts. And so really trying to bring people together. In the UK as well, there's some efforts there to really try to shift the research orientation towards these grand challenges. And there's new methodologies coming out of this work to try to bring together different stakeholders, not just cross-disciplinary, but cross-sector. So working, between academics and the health sector, education sector, to really think through how a more concerted effort might be made to address some of these problems. And there's new methodologies like sand pit, which I've used with teachers, which is kind of fun. It's literally a sand pit. Like you just bring people together and you let them play, kind of. They play with ideas. They come together, and it's quite an interesting approach. And there's some literature around that that's looking at how sand pit kind of methodology works and so on. Because sometimes it's quite difficult to bring people from different disciplines together. I mean, it's a little bit like herding cats, it's sort of, everybody has their own agendas, their own values. And I think that's something that, has to be kind of established up front, is to try to develop some collective commitments. And I think maybe I should check to make sure they can hear me okay. Can you hear me okay over there? Hello, I should say hi to everybody.
Yes,
Okay,
the
good.
sound is clear. Thank you,
Great.
Dr. Mark, for checking.
That's the usual microphone. And so this interests me a great deal, I think. But I was going to, I didn't want to go into the impact factor, because I know that's an important issue in the university here. We do want graduate students to publish. I just went through some CVs today for a candidate, and the first thing that you notice is that there's some that just have not published, and they don't demonstrate much publication potential or research potential. So I think for the graduate students that are here, it is very important to get those publications in and to demonstrate that you have that publication capacity and potential. But anyways,
Now we have the microphones.
okay. I think that there's one article though that I would recommend, and I actually printed it out just to remind myself to recommend it. But it's an article by Nicholas Burbulis, who's a pretty well-known scholar in literacy. I've used his work quite a bit, but he has written an article in Journal of Philosophy of Education, and it's called Why Publish? And I think that's important for us to think about. Why? What are we hoping to accomplish? What do we want to do? And he gives, all of a sudden my voice got really loud. Do I hold this or just?
Yes, you can hold it. Yeah,
Maybe it just-
you can hit it.
How's that? Okay, is that okay? All right, good. And in one section here, he gives advice. I've taken to telling my students the following. I won't go into it, but I would recommend taking a read, because I think it gives a different perspective on publishing. The one thing that Amanda Cooper did say, though, that is encouraging is that the top scholars who are highly cited and doing high quality research are also the people who are doing the translational work. And they're the people who are engaging with stakeholders and society to address some of these problems. And so I think that, having developed a strong foundation of research and publication, and then really thinking about how can I make this research evidence, these research findings, much more accessible, useful, and practical for different kinds of stakeholders is an important step. So I was going to talk about, just as an outline, I was going to talk about purpose and practice. This is more for graduate students. I was going to talk about, connecting and collaborating. And then because I put in that I was a highly conflicted academic, I thought I'd talk a little bit about tensions as a productive sort of generative force in terms of the work that you do. So in terms of purpose, Monday night, in my master's class, Fatima Al-Nuaimi took us through a writing activity of defining our purpose. I thought it was just a great activity. It was a chance for me even, and I think for the masters, the rest of the class, to really think about why are we pursuing a master's? What do we want to, if they're going into leadership, who do they want to be as leaders? That kind of idea. And I think every once in a while, it's important to revisit our purposes. And since it's World Teachers Day. A good example of this is John Dewey's Pedagogic Creed, My Pedagogic Creed, it's called. Yeah, it's a good, I think those kinds of positions that, kind of statements of purpose are really important to kind of remind ourselves why we've entered into academia, why we're wanting to do research. The other thing that I wanted to mention is the idea of practice. And, I think scholarship is a craft and it requires a lot of practice. It means reading and writing. And I think you really just, as graduate students, you have to love the work. You just have to, my colleague, James D'Amico, calls it the discipline of the desk. It's sitting a lot, it's sitting at a desk like this. That's why I had to have this desk. It feels just right. It feels right, to be behind a desk. But it's being on your laptop, it's reading, it's really taking the time to think through things and really writing. And the research methodologies are just something that require a lot of practice. And so that idea of practice, I wanted to just stress and getting a clear sense of purpose. And I think one of the questions to ask yourselves as a graduate student, especially, is, what kind of impact am I going to make? What am I about? What is going to be my contribution, to scholarship? What's going to be my contribution to the field? And really thinking through that and kind of positioning yourself in the field to make that contribution. And it can be in the UAE, but it also can be internationally, positioning yourself in the field internationally. And so getting familiar with the scholarship in your field, I think, is very important. But I wanted to talk about the two C's, connect and collaborate. I think the other thing is, maybe this is just, it's fresh on my mind because we're working on this in the PhD class, but the importance of synthesizing, being able to look across a lot of data. Howard Gardner calls this searchlight intelligence, the ability to kind of, scan the horizon, to be able to kind of pick what is really important to whatever problem you're working on, and being able to really, think through some of the different connections, I think, that are in the literature, and making new connections. And I was saying to the PhD class last week that there's very little discovery in educational research. It's really more about making new connections, connecting up different theories, maybe drawing on different methodologies. And for that reason, I think it's important also. The second type of connection, I think, is across disciplines. It's cross-disciplinary. I think, the more broadly you read, and I've been fortunate, I guess, to be in the humanities and social sciences, but I imagine most disciplines are like this. But, I read widely. Myra knows, in economics and sociology, psychology, political science, but getting outside of education sometimes and reading other works is really can be very insightful. I think it provides different kinds of lenses for us to think about educational problems, which are always situated in multiple contexts. And so better understanding those contexts, I think, comes from reading in different fields and being familiar with different fields, not just sticking to educational literature, which I find sometimes boring, but I like to read like not your work. I've actually enjoyed reading people's work in here, and I use it in classes to kind of showcase, I think, things like good literature review, problem statements. Dr. Alavi used one of your problem statements from an article around the mentoring and induction programs. And I think these are models for graduate students to be able to use. The collaboration is also important. I think one of the things that while you're a graduate student here is to find a good collaborator. It might be a professor, but it probably will be one of your peers, a fellow graduate student. But to really find someone that you can work with. And again, this is my personal preference. I know that sometimes scholarship can be a lonely pursuit, where you're kind of just working on something by yourself. But for me, it's always been collaborative, and I like the give and take and the dialogue and the deliberation to work through problems. And so I've been really fortunate to have two wonderful collaborators. One that actually met in graduate school at Michigan State University, James D'Amico, and we've been very close friends and colleagues for several years. We have a new book out just this month on how to confront climate denial. And James has been wonderful to work with. We're very different. I'm much more, I write to work through problems, and I write a lot. And a lot of it isn't necessarily very good. So he's a master. He comes from a language and literacy background. And so he's really a master at revision. And so sometimes I'll write a couple of pages, and then the next thing I know, he's cut all of it out. I'm like, what are you doing, man? Like, what? I just spent a lot of blood, sweat, and tears on that. I thought it was pretty good. But then I find later he'll go, we need a section on this. I go, yeah, I wrote that 3 months ago. Remember? You cut it out. So, but we go back and forth, and I think it works pretty well. And I've been lucky to collaborate with Tracy Alviar Martin around global citizenship education. And so, and I think one of the things that has worked for us is that we're both, my collaborators or colleagues, they're very responsive. So we can almost work on articles. I've been, in Singapore and now here, we can almost work on articles like 24/7 sometimes. We really have to crank something out because, I'll finish up, send it for, we're working in a Google Doc, and, Tracy will get up in the morning, and then I wake up and wow, this is looking good now. So, but I do think, finding good collaborators is really important. And most of the work that I've done, and I don't know if there's opportunities for this here at UAE, but a lot of the research projects that I had in Singapore were what were called developmental projects. And so first and foremost, they were meant to develop resources. And so again, this is an impacting teachers in terms of designing curriculum, designing technology tools, designing pedagogical strategies. And so actually most of the research that I did was developmental, and it's a very creative process and really a lot of fun. And I don't know if there's opportunities for that here, but I worked at Michigan State. I worked on a project called Project Time. I was the team leader, and we had a $5.2 million innovation challenge grant. And we created curriculum, technology tools. We created the Meaningful Learning Toolbox. We did professional development with teachers. So it was really giving, the students like myself and James worked on it as well. It really gave us just such a tremendous experience in terms of not only doing research, but also working with teachers, designing curriculum, working with technology specialists. And then James and I developed the critical web reader, which was to guide students in terms of evaluating online information critically. And it's probably been used by thousands of students and teachers around the world. I ran projects in Singapore, and James has run them in Indiana, but we had people in New Zealand and a lot of different places using them. And then at NIE2, we did a historians lab, which provided resources around how to teach history and help students engage in historical reasoning, learn how to think like a historian and work like a historian. Same thing with the sustainability learning lab. So we were, that was for geographers, and we developed a data portal and an app to help students and teachers work with field data, go out into the field, do field work in geography. So those kinds of experiences were just really formative, I think, for me, in terms of thinking about this commitment to doing work other than just publication work, but thinking about my commitments to teachers. And I'm at heart, I think, a teacher. My grandmother was a teacher. My wife is a teacher, and a really good teacher. My son is a teacher. I'm not sure. I think he's pretty good. But he's a social studies teacher. And I think this commitment to teaching and to figuring out problems in teaching has always been something that's kind of been driving me, even as a teacher. And then the last part that I want to talk, how are we doing for time?
Maybe 5 more minutes.
Okay, good. The last part that I wanted to talk about was this. Dr. Myra knows that I'm a highly conflicted person in general. I think I try to do no harm, and I try to make a positive, meaningful contribution, I think, in the best ways that I can. But I'm also aware that I think some of the some of the systems and structures that we have in place are really very highly problematic, and they need some pretty radical transformation and change. And so I'm always in this, and I think education tends to reproduce a lot of those structures and systems. And so there's always this sort of tension, but I think it's a pretty good tension. And I think it's important, you know, as scholars to, you know, to live those tensions in some ways, live the questions, you know, kind of that idea, you know, like things that are bothering you, there's a reason that they bother you. And I think part of my training in history and social sciences is that mostly a lot of personal problems are social problems. They're created by social conditions. And I think right now, especially since COVID and even before COVID, we're realizing how harmful some of the systems are that are in place, and we continue to, we're struggling, I think, to get out of them and to shift them and to change them and to think about alternatives and other ways to do things. And so I think education is one field where we do have those opportunities sometimes to think through that as educators. How can we do schooling differently? You know, what might a different type of curriculum look like? It's much more empowering for all learners. You know, how do we make sure all students and all faculty contribute in very meaningful ways? You know, they're able to achieve their potential. Michael Sandel, the Harvard philosopher, uses the term contributive justice. The idea that we need to think about a broader range of contributions, that we need to be more inclusive in terms of allowing people to contribute in their own ways to different things. And so I think, you know, this is a collective effort, and this tension was something I was reminded of from my first paper as a graduate student. First paper I published, I printed it. I still have it. It's pretty old, but and it was my, I think, so I went from being a teacher into academia, and you know, all of a sudden I was like, it was completely disorienting. I'm like this is like semi-retirement. Like, what are these people doing here? You know, I'd never had that kind of time to think and to read and to write. And the interesting thing was that I also left after, so I was being socialized to be a scholar, to be an academic, which is very different. It's a different kind of identity. There's a different sort of discourse. The university is a very different culture than schools. And so everything was quite jarring for me, actually. And I just led me to ask a lot of questions. And so the article that I wrote it's called A Case for Engaged Intellectual Work. And it's very critical of scholarly work, actually, of academia. And of you know, so I start out that, you know, many intellectuals working in the universities have become increasingly insulated and isolated from the main group. You know, this idea, you know, like you guys are out of touch. You know? But I'm enjoying it. But you're out of touch, you know. So I used different models of intellectual work. I drew on Foucault's idea of the specific individual, Antonio Gramsci's idea of organic intellectual. I think Paulo Freire, you know, the idea of love and dialogue as a means for sort of change. Henry Giroud's transformative teacher, these kinds of ideas. Edward Said was very important in this as well. And I settled on Grace Lee Boggs as kind of my model of a engaged intellectual, I think. And I don't know if you know Grace Lee Boggs. She's written some books, but she's an Asian American activist that grew up in Detroit, and I had a chance to hear her speak at ARA, but she's always, I think, for me, been a model of this kind of engaged intellectual, someone who does intellectual work and writes and so on, but is also engaged with communities and is making that sort of bigger impact, I think, that I was talking about at the beginning of the talk. Anyways, if you want to read this, it's quite interesting. I hadn't read it in a long time, but I think that tension, you know, I still have some tensions around some of this. I want to do meaningful work. I want to do work that I feel is impactful and will contribute. I'm worried about a lot of things. But, I think, I'll stop there. And
Okay.
that's probably
All right.
good. Thanks.
Thank you, Kenzie. Round of applause. So I will just be asking for the first 15 minutes or so, and then I will leave the last 15 minutes for Q&A. Both attendees, physically, face-to-face, and online as well. All right, so my first question is, you have been in positions of leadership for a long time in Singapore. I was just wondering how you navigated the tension as well between the expectations, let's say, from university top management.
Yeah.
And how you practice your own kind of leadership, of course, recognizing that you're a white male academic
Yeah.
coming from the US, and we are, for example, how will that translate to, say, female leaders of color who are also in, positions of being able to make changes? How do we convince top management to look at meaning over metrics, for example?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and one that I've struggled with a great deal. I mean, I think when I was the head of HSSE, I'd always joke that we would put up the barricades and just sort of do our thing, and not, I think that, I do think that as a leader, part of what I tried to do is shield people from some of the demands of upper management so that they could focus on the work that was meaningful to us collectively as a academic group. And, I think it's recognizing that some of the requirements and demands, are probably best if met minimally. Don't try to spend too much time on some of this that is satisfying someone who knows very little about the work that we're doing. So it always bothered me that some of these decisions were being made that I think adversely impacted the work that we were trying to do, which we thought was actually quite meaningful, working with teachers and so on. But yet decisions were being made from very far off that were really pretty, I think, difficult. So I think the first part is, we read Michael Fullan in the leadership classes, and he has, I think, he and Kurtman have 7 core competencies of leaders. And the first one is challenge the status quo. That I think, and again, I mean, maybe it comes from a male kind of American white perspective, I think, but this idea that we do have to, I think, represent and give voice to people that are maybe struggling in different ways under some of the demands. I think that I try to be aware of my privilege, and I think there are people that help me do that, like you and my daughter. And,
We have lengthy conversations over breakfast about poverty and the like.
And when I went back, I went back to the United States to help my daughter out, who was finishing up her PhD and really kind of struggling. And she was very much involved in politics before the 2020 election. And so I was able to vicariously participate in some of the things that she was participating in, like the student strike at University of Michigan, and being online, listening to how distraught some of the students were with some of the decisions. And the management was really trying to crush the student union and so on. And then I participated, or didn't participate, but I, again, kind of with her, we attended some Black Lives Matter seminars and webinars, basically. And that was really very educational for me. And we had some, I think, tremendous conversations. We completely disagree. I'm an educator at heart. And I think, Dad, like that's your male white privilege. And, but we have to try. We have to, try to, talk and do these things. And she's like, no, she has a much more confrontational kind of position, I think, in general around some of these issues. But I think, one of the things that I was reminded of is that, we do have to give up the stage. Like we just have to shut up sometimes, just not, I mean, I think it's just me, not you. But I think it's, it's checking that that privilege, and it's giving up, some things. I think it requires sacrifice, and it's very difficult. I benefit tremendously from the privileges that I have, and it's just an ongoing. I think it's an ongoing struggle, And again, I think this is where these kinds of changes are really important, because we have to give way and we have to create something that's very different. I used a quote from Grace Lee Boggs, and I'll read it because I think it's
Sure.
she's an African. She's married to an African American. What we need to do instead is encourage groups of all kinds and all ages to participate in creating a vision of the future that will enlarge the humanity of all of us. And then in devising concrete programs on which they can work together, if only in a small way, to move toward their vision. This idea of, it's a much more of a collective, I think, bringing people together and trying to work through things in a collective way, to develop new visions and to create alternatives, that kind of idea. So
I know that you are currently working on a book chapter on visioning,
yeah,
particularly in leadership. So if you were to re-envision, let's say, for example, a world university of the future that is of your own design,
wow.
what would that vision be like?
Well, I do think that we need to shift our orientation towards kind of a higher purpose rather than rankings and being number 12 in the world or whatever. I think it's around these grand challenges. I think it's saying, these are pressing, these are urgent problems that we face collectively, and that we need to mobilize research and knowledge and teaching around these kinds of problems. And we need to think about the kinds of skills and knowledge that's necessary to address these problems, to understand them and address them. So I think that would be one thing. And I think that we, the university itself, there's a lot of work being done in decolonizing the university.
Correct.
Yeah. And I really like some of the work, by Sharon Stein and Vanessa Di Andreatti and people out of, I think they're somewhere out of the University of British Columbia. But it's really starting to, I think we have to challenge some of the structures that are in place. And, as far as creating, I think the problem is, we're in this period of time where we know that what we have isn't working real well, and that it's causing great harm, planetary harm and harm to humanity. And we can't keep going this
The way
way,
we do, yeah.
but we don't have clear alternatives. And I think though that there's a lot of movement towards smaller kind of grounds up kinds of initiatives that I think are quite encouraging. But there's a lot of big money and a lot of vested interests and a lot of power that's blocking some of those kinds of things. And so, part of it is, maybe it's it requires political struggle and that kind of thing. So you're not just going to transform the university overnight. I think it's going to take a long process. But universities came out of the the colonial period, capitalism, all that was happening. Science comes out of that whole period in history. These structures and these systems kind of work. They're very interrelated. And so I think it's in the book that James and I have out, we talk about the stories we live by that are fairly destructive. The idea that nature exists to serve us, the idea of continual growth, economic growth without limits. These are destructive stories that we've lived by. We've inherited these legacies for a long time, and so we propose new stories to live by. I think tends to rethink our relationship to each other and to nature and our environments and so on. It's going to take a lot of work. So I don't know. Yeah, I think the alternative university. I don't know. One time when I was interviewed for a teaching job, I was interviewed by a whole committee, and they said, "What would be your ideal school?" I said, "It'd be a bus." I would get in a bus, we'd drive around, we'd go to New Orleans, we'd learn the history, we'd learn the culture, we'd listen to jazz music, we'd eat Cajun food, we talk to people, we just like that's the ideal school. They were like, okay, they gave me the job.
Yeah, so you
So
all,
the university, I don't know about the university as a bus, but I think there's actually, I shared this in one of the talks. There's the University of Aberdeen has I don't know if they call it a manifesto, but it's the university that is committed to its community.
Mm,
Yeah, it's really worth checking out. It's a very inspiring, and it's dedicated to a civic purpose.
mm,
And
Civic
it takes on
engagement.
civic responsibility. And I think that comes the closest maybe to articulating some of the ways that I would think about a university. Was that? Exactly, that's it. Yes, exactly. Yeah, that it belongs to us.
Yes.
Yeah.
Taken away from us.
Mm,
Yeah.
To reclaim
Yeah.
it.
Reclaiming the university. I think that's the title of the manifesto, actually. And I don't even know if they call it a manifesto. It sounds kind of.
That's actually the title of
Yeah.
Dr. Mark's talk, Reclaiming the
Yeah.
University. So perhaps for my final question, I'm looking at the time and I really want to open it up to discussion. You've also mentioned decolonizing, the curriculum, decolonizing, schools, etc. We actually have Dr. Ruwani Tubas with us right now, who has done a lot of work when it comes to
See there
decolonization.
somewhere behind me?
Yeah. Hi, Ruwani. Are you with us? So he is with us
Okay.
from University College London. So I think for my final question, you talked about sacrifice.
Yeah.
Initially, what are some of the things that you found you had to sacrifice being an academic, the things that you had to give up in order to conform within the stipulated structures of the system?
Well, I don't know. A balanced life. No, I mean, it's a very privileged position. So it's hard to say that I've sacrificed much. And it's also, the university is a place that works very well for white males. I can remember being a graduate student, and James, my colleague's wife, who was his wife then, was really having a difficult time at graduate school. And James and I were like going, wow, this is great. What are you talking about? It's this idea that it doesn't work for everybody. I mean, it's not, there's a different way of talking. There's a different way of being in these sorts of settings. And I think that, I think I haven't sacrificed enough, to tell you the truth. I think it's, giving up the space and, taking more of a back seat and decentering myself. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Mhm.
I get so wound up though that I have to always jump into things. It's hard sometimes to kind of step back from things and turn things over to other people. But I think that it's important. Yeah.
Mhm.
Other sacrifices. No, I think in general, there's probably not enough sacrifice.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. All right.
James Baldwin wrote a lot about sacrifice.
That's true.
That I think is that every society is always built on others' sacrifice, to some extent. So it's being more aware of it, and I think
Yeah.
reckoning with it.
Yeah. Okay, all right. So maybe we can now open it up to questions first from the audience, and then Najla, please be there too. So there is a comment from Ruwani, not a question, but a comment. My experience working with fellow journal editors and scholars who wish to re-envision the processes of knowledge production is that one, all change remains within the same problematic logic of knowledge production. And number two, much thinking is what we can do to make others change their ways, but little on reflecting on our own privileges, and much of them we need to let go. So any comment on that?
Well, I think it's spot on. I think the reflection is important, and I think letting go is very important. And I think just very difficult to do at times. But yeah, and I think I agree completely. And I think that it's hard to get out of this logic. It's hard to get out of the paradigms and even the sort of the structures that we're in. And I think that's why when I guess. One of the things I remembered is when I went to Michigan State University, David Lavery, who's a sociologist of education, just repeatedly told us as graduate students to take risks, to think differently, to try to envision otherwise. But again, I think it's challenging. We don't have a very good, but I think it's an imaginative process. It's a creative process. It has to be a collective process. It has to be working. I think there has to be a lot of counter narration that challenges the dominant narratives.
It's also called restoring
Yeah, restoring.
counter narratives. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Questions, feedback, thoughts? Okay, go ahead. Just a moment. I think you might need the microphone.
Just granting this course about questioning, and you have mentioned that the free white male is going to be privileged to you, but if they are in a situation that you are happy with.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I've lived in several countries, and I think that even there, I think I've worked and lived in Israel, Singapore 2 different times, Saudi Arabia, Taiwan, and now here. And I think that white male privilege kind of follows you into these different contexts. But I think that it's given me an opportunity to be uncomfortable enough at times, because I think, even living in these countries, you're just sort of scraping the surface of the depth of a particular culture and what it means to live in a society. And so, but I think that I can't honestly. Yeah, I think that there wasn't a time necessarily where probably it sort of left me unless I made an effort to make sure that it did. Yeah, it seems like it's something that it seems to be, again, it's part of this colonial kind of imagery that we have of people and of things. So I guess it's a great question. Yeah, but I've been, I'm perpetually uncomfortable.
Yes.
And overanalyzing.
over analyzing, worried, and but I think but I think that reflection is important, and trying to work through things, trying to figure things out. I think that's been, I think even as a young person, I was trying to figure things out, like how do things work with, yeah.
And I'm glad that you actually mentioned discomfort in our class the other night, and Dr. Rawani was our guest lecturer and went through all the security clearances, by the way. So we were talking about the pedagogy of discomfort as well, which hopefully would lead towards more embracing. Pedagogies too.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think the most uncomfortable is always with my daughter. She holds me to the fire like nobody else.
A physicist, right?
She's a physicist. Yeah, she's a solar physicist right now, but I don't know where we went wrong. All the teachers in the family, and then she's but yeah, but she's very political. She's very politically oriented. She's what?
She's science oriented person. That's why she's challenged all ideas.
I think so.
Don't accept things without evidence.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's part of it. She just has that sort of critical kind of mind, and kind of
Can I
innate.
just take this opportunity? Yeah, one of the last point you mentioned about the challenge and sacrifices. I think I would agree with you that there is no sacrifices in heaven. You can say, well, I lost this and I think the gain more than the
Yeah.
heaven.
Yeah,
That's my own point.
that's interesting. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Your output, you mentioned that your first output.
Yeah.
It would be very interesting to look at it now, and see what are the things that you can do differently, or things that you can do.
I think I've become the person I was critiquing.
Yeah, because it's not critically looking into.
Yeah.
And also, very interesting, I hear that some words that from science also, insulating. You mentioned-
Yeah.
What do you think? You are so excited about brown.
I read everything. Yeah. Yeah, thanks. Thanks.
Okay, so any other, okay, Dr. Shashi, okay.
Thank you for such wonderful ideas you shared with us. My question is very broad, general. Since you have experience in several places and countries and also in leadership position in education, sometimes I think, what is our position in education? Let's say education is the most important thing in everyone's life since the start of the world. But what is the positionality of education as a field itself? And what is the positionality of college of education everywhere?
Yeah.
I see its image diminishing. Why that is happening? It should be the first priority everywhere, in every country, every society. But the education sector is being weaker and weaker and weaker. So what would be your response as leader in education?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to we almost have to think of education as a social movement, I think, in some ways, and I think sort of mobilize and organize and have greater solidarity, among ourselves in sort of making the case. But I think, like, especially universities and education in general has been under attack for quite some time, actually. I think it's been weakened. I think, we're seeing the effects of it in terms of some of the polarization, some of the conspiracy theories, some of the misinformation and disinformation that spreads. I mean, I think it's very dangerous. I think it's education has been used to, pacify and mollify large segments of our population. And, a lot of this, has been supported by big money and, to promote particular kinds of interests. So I think it's a really, really important question. We need to think about how we can, kind of mount a challenge to some of this. But there's been these sort of, I mean, the university's been corporatized. It's always now it's really about the bottom line. It's, corporate oriented research, to benefit corporations. I see this as part of a bigger context that's quite disturbing, across different, all different sectors, I think. Even healthcare, I think, has taken a hit, with some of the things that are going on there. So again, this is, it's going to take a lot of work, and it's sort of but I think, I see it as more of a social movement and a political movement, kind of, that has to be mounted somehow. Yeah, it's very difficult, I think. I think again, we're all over. We're trying to figure out how do we, what do we do to resist? What do we do to transform? What do we do to change some of these systems? And it's quite challenging, I think. Yeah. Great question.
One last question from the face-to-face attendees, and then we turn it over to Najla for the online attendees.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, it is a panorama, from the beginning of your writing up to, growing up, it's understanding of all those things from your experience, from your lived experience. But one thing is connecting in the idea of internationalization of education. It makes it, the flavor of, institute is no longer, the institution became more alive all around the globe.
Yeah.
According to the Western system.
Yeah.
And produce the same type of, those people who are memorizing, and what you mentioned, intellectuals in a form that is reducing the sense, and even the evaluation, the question of what if we vision a new institution,
Yeah.
It is in this vicious circle of a frame of reference of a Western,
Yeah.
state of mind. I'm not sure, it's like how this internationalization and globalization, it's like save the world instead of, it's like making the same thing over and over again, the same sort of the same thing. Although it is varied, but it is the same.
Yeah.
And who, it's like it is a power relationship in terms of, even though we talk about multicultural, they talk about it in terms of, it's like a Western state of mind.
Yes.
And not, it's like decolonizing in a sense that, it's like it is deep rooted in the culture, or like what it was Saeed or the matches.
Yeah.
Those are kind of things. So this kind of internationalization, like how it is reproduction of the same system, the same thing, the same conformity, or
Yeah, I think, I mean, I was trying to think through this a little bit in Singapore and then some of the work I was doing in Asia. We were drawing on a Taiwanese scholar by the name of Chen. And he has a book called Asia as Method. And he has some tools and approaches, I think, that are, he refers to critical syncretism. It's sort of, much more of a hybrid kind of approach, I think, to some of these problems. But he also talks about interreferencing Asian society, so staying within the region to learn more and to draw on the immense cultural values and strengths that these cultures have had for for a very long time. There's a lot of strength and wisdom in these cultural traditions. And so I think, this idea of Asia as method, I think it's looking inward to some extent to say, scholarship started in the Islamic world, it was, and then it spread to Europe and then, and so, there's strengths within cultures that I think have to be, that has to be the refocus kind of to look back at those sort of values and wisdoms and knowledges. Santos talks about an ecology of knowledges, not relying so much on a particular kind of knowledge, but diversifying sort of the stories, the knowledge that we have access to. We're realizing that we have a lot to learn from indigenous people in terms of our relationship to our environments and in terms of sustainability and so on. So I think it's a reorientation in some ways back into some of these kinds of traditions, values that we've drawn strength from for a long time in our cultures.
Thank you for that. Apologies, Najla. So I think we might extend a little bit, maybe 5 minutes or so. So Najla, questions maybe from your end?
So far, I don't see. I saw a remark by Dr. Rouhani, which I think you've already read, Dr. Moira.
Correct. Yes.
If anyone has questions, please do type them in the chat box.
Yeah. Rouhani, you want to say something? We can hear you, by the way.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, I can't turn on my video. So I've been listening very, very intently. So thank you very much, Mark. I just wanted to follow up on the comment that I had, and I think one example that I can give actually is the one that I have been working on with your journal, in your university, because my experience is that I have invited quite a number of scholars, but for all sorts of reasons that we know, many turned them down. But those who eventually said yes are those who have, in a sense, what you might call, for lack of a better word, a higher purpose in the publishing itself. And so, like, not much. I mean, there are other interests, like, for example, for broadening knowledge production, engaging in more critically in the process of knowledge making, and so on and so forth. So my point basically here is that there are spaces, possibilities to probably address inequities in knowledge production. But at the same time, I think my feeling is there needs to be a little bit more push institutionally to recognize these as well. Because I understand why those other invited were turned down. Although I don't somehow I understand those who are just starting, because they want to reserve their publication to something that might really count. But the senior ones that I invited, those who really publish very, very often, still turned it down. So I don't know what exactly they are looking for, because they already have
Right.
much. Yeah. So yeah, so that's basically that.
Yeah. Yeah, I started a journal in Singapore actually, and it was for practitioners, and you can still get people to contribute even though it's not, I mean, so we had top academics, at least in humanities and social studies, that contributed, but yeah, I think everything gets geared towards this, push to publish in high impact journals, and it becomes kind of a vicious cycle. Verbulis's article is really excellent, and he talks about how actually half of the articles in these high impact journals aren't even being cited. We don't even know if they're being read. And there's a particular bias against humanities and social sciences in terms of in education too, and so but part of it is I think we are socialized into kind of playing the game, being able to figure out how to do this, and but it becomes this sort of vicious cycle. We're just kind of churning out stuff that maybe
which is what I mentioned earlier about how much of our privileges do we actually want to let go. Especially
How much privilege do we want to let go?
oh
yeah,
right,
yes,
right, yeah,
especially for a lot of those senior ones who I suppose wouldn't need one more publication, and yet still refuse to publish in alternative spaces of academic production.
So just to provide some context, Rawani, I'll just provide them a little bit of context. Dr. Rawani, who was from UCL, has agreed to serve as a guest editor for our journal, the IJRE. But the people that he invited, who happen to be highly ranked, top-ranking scholars in the field, turned him down because it's not a Scopus index journal, is what he's saying. Yeah. Okay, so yeah. You want to say
US's. Yeah, that
Yeah, thank you. I think struggling with this issue for 2 years now, dissemination of knowledge, production of knowledge. I think what you mentioned, Mark, is very important. When we create knowledge, it is not really for the impact factor. We are led toward that, which is not right, really. The impact factor is important, but really we need to have an impact on society, on people on the ground, on policymakers. And now what is happening, we are going to do that stream to get published in high impact factor journal, which I think is fine, but this is not the only thing in the world. What we are doing, we are going to do that stream, and we are leaving the ground for publishers, money-making people, to address people on the ground, and they get the money. So we work hard day and night. We get little value of that. Exactly. No money or nothing. No, I publish a journal. At the end of the day, with the people on the ground are the people who are hijacked by publishing companies and publishing houses. And when you do that, for example, I contributed to one of the largest encyclopedia in the world on English language teaching, and it hasn't been recognized as an impact publication. So, and this is, we received the top publisher award in the world 3 years ago. Nevertheless, because it's not cited, then it is not recognized. And I think this is what the mission we need to challenge the status quo. We have to say that we are targeting people on the ground, professional teachers, for example, like the one that's saying and you are saying, rather than only for the sake of producing knowledge. We need to disseminate knowledge to go beyond the research domain. And I think it is our duty to do that. I look at my own publication. I contributed with people on the ground, like teachers, like even, the public, I think.
Yeah.
And I was thinking of really applying something, probably we could collaborate in the college to write a book or could be edited or ordered that what are our audiences, not only academics, but also
Right.
people on the ground, professionals, and even society. In education, we need to serve our society here. It is contextualized rather by something abstract, and no one on the ground will make it better. So what we are saying, and one thing I think is very, very important. We need to put there and say, okay, we need to resist and do something that we feel that we can serve society at large.
Yeah. Yeah, this is, I know it's time to wrap up. This is called research impact literacy. And it's big in Canada. And I was working with David Phipps around this, but again, it's a hard sell to universities. I was having a hard time making a case with Nanyang Technological University and even the director of NIE to kind of make some of these sorts of shifts to recognize a broader range of impact. But I think it is important work, I think. And I think for our graduate students too, a lot of people are not going into academia. And I think, the skill sets that you're developing, the ability to analyze and work with large sets of data, to be able to communicate clearly, to, all these kinds of skills are much needed in a lot of different sectors of society. And I think there's other opportunities. And so I think if we don't start to kind of address some of this, I think we lose people that could do also good work in the university, that kind of thing. So, yeah.
I wish we could talk with Professor Mark longer, maybe the entire day.
We do have an online question, Dr. Myra, if time permits.
Maybe one last.
Yes, sorry to keep you.
Yes, maybe
So the question is from Mr. Dingfai Shen. He says, Dr. Mark, how do you turn your life journeys into valuable resources for your research, as you have worked in so many different countries?
How do I turn my life?
Can you say that again, Najla? How does he turn
Sure.
around?
How do you turn your life journeys into valuable resources for your research, as you have worked in so many different countries?
Yeah, I think, well, I guess a good question. I think it helps me appreciate culture and context so much more, that everything is sort of situated in these different kinds of contexts. And I'm innately curious. I think, part of wanting to, academia has been great. Education has been wonderful because it enables people like me to continue to just learn and learn about people, places, issues, to really, I think the other aspect of it is that I come into contact with just different perspectives all the time, different ways of thinking about things. And so that's, I think, definitely helped my scholarship and even my teaching to just be much more aware of the different perspectives and so on. Yeah.
Can I propose an answer to that question
Okay.
as well? How
Yeah.
Dr. Mark will transform his life experiences. Perhaps in 5 years' time, Dr. Mark would create this alternative space that he is talking about, this kind of envisioned world university, and then we would all just resign and apply to your envisioned university. But thank you all for being here. Please do sign the attendance sheet if you haven't signed it yet. And do take note of the feedback form, because we really, really need your feedback. And we hope to see you later during the informal gathering of graduate students at 4:30 in the Princeton Auditorium. Thank you, everyone. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Door prize for graduate students who want to read by. Thank you. Thanks.
Wonderful.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
For the paper, the one by the Amanda.